Hi, my name is Kuzey Bektaş, and I'll be talking about how language affects our thoughts. Throughout the development of linguistics, scientists figured out that the language we're born into and the languages we learn leave a great dent in the structure of our thinking and our imagination. This situation is widely named as Worfianism, after the famous philosopher who worked on it. Benjamin Lee Worf claimed that we thought in words. Thus, bigger our repertoire of words, the bigger our thoughts, ideas, and imagination of the world. This idea brings me to a knowledge question. Basically, how much does language affect human thought? In real life, there are many cases that link to the Worfianist approach. One of the most commonly mentioned situations is how the Inuit people devised leagues of words to describe different states of snow. This situation produces a weak example to Worfianism, in my opinion, since it is sufficient in providing evidence to how language is affected by surrounding, but fails to explain how language itself affects the perception of that surrounding. Insufficient examples like these led many philosophers, such as Steven Pinker, a very famous thinker, to claim Worfianism is dead. However, another recent example from an experiment led in Stanford University by Lera Broditsky finally could produce a good example, a good evidence to the Worfianist approach. In Russian language, basically the most mentioned and the most used color word is blue, unlike common opinion, one would think that it's red, but it is blue. And the experiment mentioned tested the reaction times of different native speakers of the Russian language to different colors. And the Russian speaker group, as the hypothesis expected, showed significantly faster reactions to identifying different shades of blue compared to the control groups. This supports the idea that the language we're born into affects our perception and thoughts. And furthermore, this brings a sub-knowledge question forth. How much does language affect imagination? Well, the logic that can be constructed in the first place is that since perception of color was affected so much from the language, arts and imagination, which are interlinked, should be a part of this too. Alexei Mikheyev, in his writing Color Symbolism in Russian Language, gives perfect example to this. By meaning, blue is the most developed color symbol in the Russian language, even though one would expect it to be red, as I said. In his work, he claims that blue links to aristocracy, high bourgeois, love, and passion in Russian art and cultural symbolism. This situation can provide sufficient evidence to link the link between language and imagination. However, there can also be an opposing belief, and it could argue against the links between language and thought. The main argument that could be produced is that there is no telling that knowing more words about a certain topic makes our understanding and thinking of that topic better. For instance, one of the most used counterclaims against Worfianism is again from the most famous example of Worfianism itself, the Inuit example. Well, this is hypothetical, but let's assume that dry snow is called frappo, and wet snow is called espressa. Knowing these two words does not create any imagination in the classic Mediterranean person about thought of dry snow and wet snow. Even though it's theoretical, this example provides sufficient evidence to how knowing a certain word doesn't necessarily make our understanding of that concept better. Since we do not live in an area that's covered by snow 365 days of the week, we can't actually imagine wet snow and differentiate it from differentiate it from dry snow, even though we now have words to describe those things. I'm sorry. Even though the example is theoretical, it is still detrimental to the absolute statement that is Worfianism. The situation brings an approach that might change the knowledge claim from differences among languages cause differences of thought of their speaker. We can bring that to something along the lines of people have different thoughts based on paths drawn them by their languages. Basically, what I mean by this is that our languages aren't necessarily forcing us to think in a certain way, but basically all languages are closing down some barriers in their structure that limits us from thinking about certain areas that might be capable while speaking a different language. An example that an example that could be mentioned for this is a research led by Michael Frank in MIT. Michael Frank is a neuroscientist, and the experiment he conducted and the research he led was on the Piraha people, a small Amazonian community that speaks a language that does not contain any words for numbers. They don't have a one thing, two thing, three thing. Basically, the Piraha language has words for a little amount, some, and many. And there is no distinction between how much is little and how much is some and how much is many. Basically, in this experiment, in this series of experiments, researchers presented these Piraha people with a number of strings. They said that they wanted the Piraha people to give the researcher the same amount of balloons as the strings that they were presented. When they could match the strings one by one to the balloon, the Piraha participants mostly succeeded. But when this little crutch was moved from their way, when researchers forced them to remember the amount of strings and attach them to the balloons, while the strings were a limited number and they were scrambled inside a bucket or a hole or something, the Piraha people completely messed up. They could not present the same amount of balloons as the same amount of strings they were given. Yes, they would give a lot of strings if they would give a lot of balloons to the researcher if they were presented a lot of strings, as saying they would give 17 balloons if they were presented 17 strings, but they could not give they would give 15 balloons or 19 balloons if they were presented 17 strings. But unlike a normal Western person, a normal person who has a language that contains numbers, who can count, they couldn't give the exact number of balloons to the researcher. They miserably failed in that subject. I think this example shows great evidence to how a language closed down certain paths and brought down certain barriers of thinking for the Piraha and made them unable to function like us in a certain area, that is counting. Another example that's completely theoretical for this is that try to think of 17 balloons in your mind without counting them one by one. You can't just imagine 17 balloons all clumped up against each other without separating them one by one. It's impossible, since we don't have the exact structure of, we don't have the exact language structure to define large groups of masses which are numerical. Our number system is unitized. We count one by one. Now, all in all, we can see that human thought and native language are interlinked. This is a fact. The implication that can be drawn from this is that we have many different ways to interpret how exactly human brain is affected from language and how language forces us to function in a way. While some can say that different languages make people different, some people would argue that languages put pre-existing templates to our thought patterns. Thank you for listening to me.